So, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today as we cover the topic of anger management with Joelle Kiyomi. And I'll go ahead and introduce ourselves so you can get to know us a little bit more before we go into this topic, which is so important because we can definitely encounter this with a lot of our clients, maybe even family and things like that. So, my name is Bonnie. I am the continuing education lead here at Agents of Change. And some of my experience here is as a clinician, I do group sessions. I work with migrant youth. I've also worked with foster children, substance use services, adoption services, and in the hospital setting with my internship. And we encounter anger management throughout all settings that we have, right? So even the field that you might be working in currently. So we're definitely super excited to have Joel today. And let me go ahead and introduce him as far as all of the great things that he does. So he is a licensed clinical social worker. He does have his master's in business administration and also is certified in anger management, which we're going over. So we'll have these amazing tools to learn from him. And as a licensed psychotherapist, he's also the owner of JK Counseling, where he specializes in helping individuals manage their anger and uncover the emotions that lie beneath this. And so, of course, we'll get into this a little bit deeper in this hour. Um, with both this background in clinical social work and healthcare management, Joel really brings this comprehensive, person-centered approach to therapy that really emphasizes the mindfulness and emotional insight. So again, we'll get to learn a lot about this in this hour. Um, Joel does have over a decade of experience in mental health. He's worked in various settings, including outpatient clinics, community agencies, and private practice. And also, in addition to this clinical social work, he's also an adjunct professor at New York Institute of Technology. And this is where he shares all of his great expertise with, the future aspiring mental health professionals, which he's deeply committed to helping just to gain this perspective that we need as you all are connected in this training as well. So let's go ahead and cover why this topic is important, and we'll learn a little bit about what Joel does day to day in connection to anger management, and then of course connect all of the really great things here. So, of course, just wanting to cover why this is so important for us to learn today and in this hour. It's so important because anger is often a symptom of a deeper emotional distress. And hopefully, Joel can kind of explain to us kind of how we learn that anger is a secondary emotion, right? Something unresolved from trauma, fear, sadness, many other things, right? That manifests as anger, right? And addressing it can be something so that we can uncover these core issues so that our clients and families, communities, whoever it is that we're serving, can heal through this, right? So we'll also, of course, cover how poor management on learning about anger and managing our anger can really damage relationships, damage quality of life, and how we as clinicians, mental health professionals can definitely equip ourselves to help our clients navigate through anger. And of course, this important emotion that comes through, and what might be underneath, right? So, Joel, if you'd like to share just a little bit about, day to day, what you see with this and a basic overview of anger. What's important about anger?
Yeah, no, I really like that introduction into what anger is. The best way that I can kind of describe anger, it is a it is the manifestation of threatened needs, right? So how we when we're perceiving the world around us, when we perceive people around us, their actions, what they're doing, objects, inanimate objects, um, that interpretation, right, and that analysis that comes from that interpretation, if the if the determination is that that object, right, that person, that item, that action, those words, if it's determined that that's threatening our needs, anger is a response to that. So when we talk about anger being a secondary emotion, what it is that initially I have a feeling about something. It doesn't matter what it is. And then anger responds in a form of protection of the need, right? And in addition, the emotion trying to protect me from that perception of harm. So if, someone says something to me that I interpret as belittling to me, right? And ultimately the understanding of those words is it makes me feel less than, it makes me feel insecure. Maybe they're attacking somebody I care about with their words or their actions, right? And there's a vulnerability aspect to that, right? Because, if I get great value from being a protector, if I get great value from being a partner, from being a friend, from being a citizen, from being a professional, and that's being attacked by somebody's action, words, or anything else, my anger is responding in an act to protect me, right, or protect my needs more so. And so that's the heart of anger. It's that response to the idea that, something can take away this thing that I care about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Hmm.
And it's important for us to consider this in our offices or, however we are serving our clients, maybe in a school setting or home visits as well. So thank you for sharing that. Um,
Yeah.
where do we feel like there could be like a misconception or it'd be like misunderstood, whether it be in the clinical setting or in everyday life?
Yeah, I'll try to do both. Um, I think the greatest misconception about anger is the actions of anger. So anger kind of distances us from our principles, right? In order for it to be effective, perhaps in some sort of evolutionary stance in getting us to a place where we aren't restricted by, civility in some cases. So we can take on these grandiose actions in order to overcome a threat. um, but those grandiose actions can be seen as problematic and dangerous, right? And so, when we think about the most harmful acts that could happen from person to person, we notice that the precursor is anger, right? And there is some causal relationship. And so the result is this judgment around anger where people go, okay, angry people are dangerous people, right? Inherently, they are dangerous people. In the clinical world, I've even noticed a lot of therapists will try to stay clear of clients that are perceived as as angry, right? An angry client can be seen as a dangerous client, and it's no judgment towards the clinicians, but in an effort to protect their own well-being, they're saying, okay, that person's not going to be on my caseload. If a client operates, expresses themselves with anger, maybe they start yelling or screaming, maybe they even knock an object off a table, right? In some extreme cases, a therapist is or a clinician might say, okay, get that person off my caseload, get that person, I do not want that person in my office, right? So this understanding of the danger that is, it's not fictitious, it's real, but at the same time, it is an expression of something that's beneath the surface that we might need to learn about. And so I think the biggest misunderstanding with anger is that the fact that it's synonymous with danger, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And coming hand in hand. Do we see some differences from like little ones or, minors and then adult clients? And could you explain some of those differences that we see?
Yeah, I think with children, because so much of their expression of emotion is behavioral. When you see an angry child, you'll know the angry child was present because of what they've done to your office in the clinical sense. But for parents, just having a child who's manifesting so much anger could mean the destruction of property. It could mean, harming other children. It could mean all of these different things, right? And so, an angry child, going back to that concept of misconception, we go, oh, an angry child's a bad child, right? We're not drilling to the part where we're saying, okay, what are they trying to express with their anger? Because if we go to the initial premise that anger is a guardian emotion and it is protecting a need that this person has, if we can create a bridge to that need and try to learn, okay, what is that need, and communicate with that and try to create some sort of world or condition where that need can be met, that would be good for the case of the child. And then in the case of the adult, it's a similar thing I find in, both from a clinical lens and just from a sociological lens, that um, that people have a almost a very, I don't want to, I'll call it a cruel look sometimes, where we can see adults who are angry, and if they manifest, you know what I mean, in a way that might be considered childish, right? We naturally look down on them, you know. Prisons have their entire complex built around, housing people, right? Who are angry, you know, and that even becomes a determinant of whether or not of or how long the sentencing is, or how extreme the punishment that is on that person. Now, again, I'm not excusing behaviors that come from anger, but if we could drill down from the anger to the need, right, we can capture something that's very human about this person and see how they're no different than the rest of us. So that becomes the challenge I find with anger.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing that because it's definitely something that we can see, especially our clients coming in with experienced trauma, um,
Hmm.
or other things, right? And we see that they're struggling in their day to day with these behaviors, right? As the troubled child or troubled behaviors. But is it really anger or other things? So,
Well, the
okay.
trauma is a really good point because, as we know with trauma, a person gets developmentally arrested, right? So this outside experience that's impacted them, traumatizes them, and developmentally arrests them at a particular age group where they might not be able to, like we were talking about with the child, they might not be able to express their anger in a healthy way. Then they never learned a framework for how to do that, you know? And as a society, we can sometimes hold little empathy for a person when they grow up, and even as an adult, if they did not have the ability to develop a manner or a method to communicate their anger or self-regulate, self-soothe, right? Then we can hurl a kind of punishment or judgment towards them. And all their anger is trying to do is express that there's this need that this person has that was challenged in this way that was perceived as threatening. Um, so it's a really interesting thing.
Yeah. And can you share an example with us where identifying this root emotion behind anger can change the therapeutic process that we have with them?
Sure, I can think of several. I work with couples as well, and I think in couples it's always very clear because I often say with conflict it's just misaligned perspectives, and so one partner can become very irate. For example, if one partner stays out later than they had thought they could stay. So maybe the husband says that, okay, I'm going to hang out with my friends until 10, 11, 12 p.m., and then I'm going to come home, right? And then the partner, she sees that, she goes, what made you think it was okay to stay out that late? They never had a previous conversation about what's okay and not okay. Now, she's not in the wrong, he's not in the wrong. She might not be in the wrong in the sense that, she has an ideal of how a relationship works, and maybe that there's a communication structure that should be inherent, right? When they decide to take a next step together, maybe they live together, or maybe they are just partners that aren't cohabitating, but still have these kinds of. She might have this kind of arrangement in her mind because she saw her parents do it, or she came from a relationship where there was infidelity, right? And so that line of communication is necessary for her to feel a kind of way. And then there's him who might be comfortable with a particular level of autonomy and says that, okay, it's okay for me to be out to a particular hour. I don't, I'm an adult. I can stay out as long as I'd like to. Um, but this misalignment leads to conflict. Now, when the conflict happens, maybe he blows up, starts yelling at her and says, "How could you tell me what to do? How can you know what I mean?" And that can come because in his family structure, yelling was okay. Everybody did it, right? They did it towards him, they did it towards each other. There's a lot of relational trauma there, right? His mind got arrested at an age group where perhaps he had saw yelling being the kind of expression that you do when you have a need that's unmet, his need for autonomy. Or it could be on the other side with her, right? She could be angry and then she could blow up towards him, and belittle him and says your behaviors are childish, right? And that could happen because when she did something that her parents thought weren't okay, that's how they treated her. They accosted her, they yelled at her, even maybe they even used physical violence as a manner to which they can discipline her. And so, in both cases, if you looked at either one, or maybe both are operating from a similar narrative, they've internalized this kind of experience that they had growing up, and the movement into such a trauma reaction kind of prevented them, right? A trauma reaction at such an early age kind of prevented them from learning, okay, here are healthy methods of communicating needs. Here are healthy methods of trying to understand where the other person is coming from. But they didn't get that knowledge, and so they're arrested there. Now, when they come to me, right, and I see one blow up, or I see the other blow up, or I see them both blow up, right, from the outside, if I just look at anger, the aggression that's being shown in the room, right, or even the aggression that might be being done towards each other, we go, okay, there's something pathological here, right? Something is wrong with them. But if we looked at it more from, okay, they're just expressing how they adapted, how they learned how to express, you know, it's something completely different. I can go drill into the need, find the need, and their need is that, hey, I have a sense of insecurity when you're not present, or the partner could say that, hey, I really, really desire autonomy. I really love and value the ability to move as I please in the world. And that's not problematic inherently. They can communicate that. They can build some sort of agreement so that going forward, that's not they don't have to penalize each other for not meeting the other person's need.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Mm,
And so in that, it's really coming to understand one another in a different way with that help of the mental health professional coming
mhm.
in to unlock this. So with this, can you emphasize that important piece of mindfulness or the perspective in your work on anger?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Mindfulness, when I talk about mindfulness, it's understanding on two levels, understanding my thoughts, what thoughts are bubbling in my mind at a particular time, understanding what feelings I'm having right at a particular time. And by feelings, not just feelings as this intangible object, but feelings as these sensations that are happening in the body, right? So a very somatic based approach. When we understand these things, when we see these things operating, my thoughts as they're moving, my feelings as they're happening, having the ability not to act, right, based on those thoughts or those feelings, but just to watch them like a bus that's passing by, just examining them, you know, that to me is mindfulness, right? Because I am mindful of my internal experience, you know.
Yeah, thank you. And how is it that you get to introduce mindfulness to the clients that you're serving and they have this really heightened emotional state?
There's several. It depends on the client. I am big on in the room. It has to be almost like it's almost like we're playing games, right? Where some people, if their difficulty is in expressing their emotion, I have a game with them where I tell them, okay, put the feelings wheel up. on a, I work virtually, so I tell them put the feelings wheel up on the screen. And before you tell me what is in an experience, before you just run me through the narrative of an experience, start with I feel, right? So tell me I feel, right, based on what someone did to them or what their interpretation of what someone did to them. I feel X, I feel Y, I feel Z, right? That's an example of them being mindful of their feeling, right, in on a cognitive level. And then for others, right, there might be needs to be an understanding of their feeling on a somatic level. So as they're telling a story, as they're telling me about an experience, I tell them, okay, let's take a pause. I interrupt wherever we are in the session. I say, okay, let's take a pause, you know, scan your body, tell me where you feel it and how you feel it. So they might say, okay, I feel this feeling in my chest. I feel this feeling in my gut. Sometimes I put a minute on the clock and I say, okay, let's put a minute on the clock. We wait the minute and then we get into examining, okay, what do I feel? Right? Some people, they might be very cognitive based. So they go, they go, I'm not angry. Right. So, which is why I would stop and I say, okay, scan your body. And they go, okay, I feel this feeling in my chest. I feel this feeling in my gut. And then we can interpret that and say, okay, I interpret that as anger. What do you interpret it? And then we try to come to some agreement. But for the other people, they feel overwhelmed with sensation. And we say, okay, let's take a pause. Perhaps let's do a grounding skill if the feeling is overwhelming. And then we go look at the feeling wheel, try to identify where in the feeling wheel of anger, specifically in that piece of the pie, are you feeling the feeling they might say, I feel so annoyed or irritated, you know? So that's how I usually build that skill of mindfulness.
Yeah, thank you. And I love the whole like internal, because a lot of individuals aren't taught to like those internal feelings or where this is coming
Hmm.
from. Or maybe sometimes even get confused, which can be like physical pains when we don't take care of ourselves, but it can be confused as such. So how do
Hmm.
you help clients who can't connect like that internal feeling of like, what are you feeling inside, when they can't come up with some answers?
That's good. There's a couple of still more activities I would do, depending on the severity of it, right? If it's something to the effect where they're very numb to feeling, they might be trapped in what they call a dorsavagal response, which is this extreme level of disassociation, or heightened level of disassociation. And so for somebody who's going through that, one game I sometimes play is close your eyes, body scan, and tell me the first color that comes to you. And then when they think about a color, right, they might say something red. And then I say, okay, think of an object that comes from that color. And they might go, okay, a ball. And I say, what do you want to do to that ball? And then they say, I want to squeeze it. You know what I mean? And then we look at, sometimes I give them graphics about where different areas of sympathetic response show up as angry. And so then they could see it and they go, okay, so when you feel this feeling in your body, when you want to clench your fist like this, right? Or when you want to just hit something, slam something, or kick something, we can interpret this as anger. The nice thing about even through disassociation, even if I'm disconnected from anger, right, on somewhat of a psychological level, I it doesn't my sympathetic response continues to happen, right? Um, they have something they call diffuse physiological arousal, where, if I enter into a particular beats per minute, right, my thinking shifts, you know, and this can be interpreted as anger, we can, if I'm doing the body scan and I can't connect with that, but I'm doing this game of objects and my body's doing all of these motions that are synonymous with aggression. You know what I mean? Chances are I've entered into this DPA area, which is about 100 beats per minute or 90 beats per minute, depending on a person's cardiac discipline, right? If they're an athlete, for example, you tend to have better beats per minute. But it helps me interpret, okay, this person is dealing with anger, or it helps them rather interpret that, oh, I'm dealing with anger right now. The other thing that I do is I do some EMDR work. And the thing I like about EMDR is it's various phases, but the fourth phase, which is desensitization, when they begin processing, um, in these processings, if they're stuck in that dorsavagal mode, what can happen, right, and likely happens, is they start leaving that mode and enter into sympathetic arousal because they are seeing memories, they are seeing images, they're going through their neural network and hitting different kinds of associated memories. And it's almost like a movie that they're witnessing. It's not the first time, but it is another time. And then they get to see it. And in real time, they get a reaction that you can't necessarily always mask with that dorsavagal response or mask with an intellectual response, that, defense mechanism that I might try to do to distance myself from the feeling. So since it's happening so profoundly in real time, we get to see that experience together. They get to feel something that, maybe their mind is not used to assessing. And then we get to interpret, right, towards the end of the phases. We get to interpret, okay, what is it that you felt just now? And sometimes they go, oh, I didn't know that I can feel in that way. And we can give that a name. We give that to anger. Does that make sense?
Definitely. I love your example there of like where you get to go into the color and what you see and what you do with it, like
Hmm.
taking it so much further there. So
Yeah.
uh, and I hope some of our clinicians watching can definitely utilize that and talking to their clients and connecting that there. So does there tend to be common barriers that that clients face in trying to implement the mindfulness, especially when angry or having this heightened emotion
Does there tend to be common barriers for clinicians or?
for clients?
Oh, common barriers that I see is one, going back to our judgment of anger as a concept. Sometimes clients don't want to be seen as angry if they have a trauma story with anger where a parent misused anger, right? And did not have the tools to express, but instead used it in a harmful way. Then a client might say that I don't get angry, right? To kind of distance themselves. And because there's so much a negative view of anger, we can't do the work of connecting their experience, right? Or their interpretation of experience as anger. And so just that, their desire to be distant from their feeling can be one of the biggest barriers. Um, Sometimes when other diagnoses might get in the way. I think that one, for example, if you're using polyvagal as your method for assessing, which is my favorite for assessing, if a client is suffering from major depressive disorder and they're really stuck in that dissociative state, um, it's hard to get healing is actually them reaching the sympathetic state because they've now moved up into that anger. So I say, okay, when we get angry, yay, but moving them from that state of just being so disconnected with life and reality, getting them out of that into a place where they're feeling more and they're more familiar with feeling, and so that they can get angry, right, lets me know, okay, we're in the right direction. Because anger, I like to think of it as anger as a precursor for change, right? If we think about prominent figures in history, whether it's Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther King, they were angry people. And so if we can move a person into a state of anger, it might get them to recognize that, okay, I need to change something. But if a person is used to, with the case of depression, develops an inferiority complex and says that I have no influence over the world. There's nothing I can do to change, you know, then they stay at this state where they won't allow themselves to feel angry. And so we kind of have to work with that. That can sometimes be a barrier in the way.
Yeah. And how do we help clients safely explore these deeper emotions, whether it be rooted to that relationship that they have with their parents, as you were first mentioning, or trauma or something else?
That's a great question. Yeah, because of and this goes back to the that idea that anger in and of itself, since it's just a guardian, and the things we're afraid of are really the actions that can come with anger, right? And the key is that could come. What we want to do is help them develop tools for one, grounding their anger so it's not overwhelming. Two, developing skills to express the anger in a healthy way. The therapeutic room is the best place to do all of that. So we teach them grounding skills, right? Diaphragmatic breathing, counting, noticing. Um, e- uh, um, Another good one might be progressive muscle relaxation. So, giving them tools to ground their anger, right? Um, and then we can start going into understanding their story, whether that understanding of the story just comes from talk therapy, whether it comes from a narrative therapeutic approach, whether it comes from an EMDR approach, if there's something that we really want to, an experience that we really want to get to. Um, Free association. It doesn't really matter the approach from there. Where I should say it matters the approach depending on your clinical training or how deep you want to go, right? But I want them to learn tools to manage the feelings that are going to come up in the room as we drill into their story and learn where their anger comes from, learn where their philosophy of anger comes from, learn where the behaviors that have become associated with their anger come from. But once they learn how to ground, once we give them tools so that they can operate in a healthier way, that's how we get to that work.
Yeah, thank you. And I know you
Mhm.
mentioned working with couples, and of course in
Mhm.
other experiences as well with the work that you've done. Have you noticed there's differences on how men versus women tend to express or mask underlining pain through anger?
I have. That's a really good question. I I want to say at first, everybody can express anger in every way, right? So, I don't want it to almost feel like you're able to predict the set of behaviors that a person's going to do, right? Just because they fall under a particular gender. Um, But what I have noticed as a trend, and maybe it's because of a larger macroscopic on the sociological scale, or maybe on a mesoscopic scale, what I have noticed is that I think that society has permitted men to feel anger almost in this action hero kind of way. So anger is exalted, it's praised if a man can use their anger in the case of protection, right? If they're protecting someone they care about, protecting their partner, protecting their children, or protecting their respect, then anger is okay, right? And then anger is okay in a very demonstrative way, you know? Um, but not all men express anger like that. I always want to make sure I preface that, but you know, that's where, so a lot of men tend to, at least a lot of the men that I can work with tend to be demonstrative in their expression of anger. A lot of the women that I notice tend to be passive with their anger. They use anger and criticism. Um, Fleeting comments, right? Things under their breath. Um, and again, this could be a sociological, right? It's not very. It might be seen as something that is not proper for women to be very expressive or demonstrative with their anger. So they found these other ways to subvert that, right? Um, but I think that's one historical place that I like to, or one, I should say, larger contextual place. But historically, what I'll just look at is what was the family that this person was raised in? What was the philosophy for anger that was passed around in his family? What was the family role that they played? How were they allowed to express their anger? And that's where I really capture where anger is. And so I I I I really like that question because sometimes the healing is in just switching, right? How we express our anger. Sometimes I need to express my anger in a more demonstrative way. I just have to do it healthy, right? And then sometimes, I need to, find a way to express my anger in a more um in a more regulated manner, right? And maybe I could borrow some of what I might learn from the other gender.
Yeah, thank you. And so I know you mentioned a lot of like growing up, right? When there's our clients are smaller. So what would this role play in our early childhood experiences, in shaping how we use anger?
Can you repeat the question? I just cut out in the end. I missed it.
So what role does early childhood experiences play in shaping how we use anger?
Oh, yes, it plays a significant role, right? If we look at attachment theory for a second, and we think about, how is the child attached with their parent? What I'm supposed to be learning in a secure attachment, the ideal attachment, is how to recognize my feeling, right? And what actions can I do towards the world to get, because feelings are connected to need. So me recognizing my emotion, my feeling tells me, oh, there's a need there. What actions can I do to have that need met? I learned that from my relationship with my parents, but in, not just my parents, but my community and all of that. If my experience with, secure attachment, with these attachments, I should say, is insecure, you know, then I might learn an unhealthy way in order to get that need met, you know. So the way that I might learn, and this is a big risk for children because their access to information is so limited just because of the restriction of the limitation of their age, right? They haven't had as much experience in the world. They haven't had that many relationships in the world. And so it it is a big responsibility of the immediate adults that we connect with to teach us how to express anger. But if I don't get that understanding, if I don't get that discipline, if I don't get that training internalized, that working model for how to navigate in the world, what I'm going to do is I could be left to just fending for myself. And I learned that, okay, let me just get really loud, right? The behavior might remain at what happened when I was a baby. And so I'm going to yell, I'm going to scream, I'm going to have a tantrum, I'm going to throw things, I'm going to roll on the floor and wail. But that's the only tool I have. So we can sometimes see a child like that in a supermarket and we go, oh, that child is that's a terrible child. Or maybe you get that as a clinician in the room and you go, oh my gosh, that child's so, annoying, or whatever judgment I might have. But in reality, no, this child just did not learn how to express, right? um Another way is because children are sensitive to information. They say that the older we get, the worse we actually are at taking in or empathizing, taking in information from the world around us. Children are really good at that. And so you can learn about the context, right? The world around the child from the child. So the child takes in all the information that's happening around them. Parents are yelling, screaming, slamming things. You know what I mean? They're stressed, even if they're not expressing that frustration or that stress in a way that's very obvious. The child's reading all of those cues, and they're learning so much about the world. And that information that they're learning about the world could put them in this heightened sympathetic state where they're using these grandiose expressions of anger, which it's the one that we tend to be afraid of, the destructive ones. Um, and I've highlighted a lot of the destructive anger, but I could be self-destructive as well. You know what I mean? Not just destructive on the world, I could be destructive on my own body. you know, with all the anger that I'm keeping. Or like I said earlier, I can move into a dorsavagal expression of my anger, right? Where I'm just depressed. I'm dissociated from life because on the surface of that is this anger that I don't know how to deal with. I don't know how to manage, and my attachments didn't teach me that.
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
And earlier, you also mentioned how our community is very important as we're watching that,
That's
um,
right.
and learning from it, right? So, what are some ways that, as clinicians, we can be culturally sensitive to address anger with clients from diverse backgrounds?
Mm. Yeah, it depends again on the age group.
Mhm.
Um, if you're working with children, then you are not just working with the child, you're also working with their family. Um, and the reason I bring that up is because sometimes the child might, depending on their age, they might not be able to articulate what is the culture that they're being raised in, right? They are just living the culture that they're being raised in. The their prefrontal cortex isn't developed enough for them to add words to what's going on. And so we work with the family and go, okay, what is happening? Um, when if you're working with adults, they might also be suffering from that experience a little bit, but at the same time, there's a higher chance that they are able to express to you. When I think of cultural competence, you can spend a lot of time, as clinicians, it is our responsibility that if you're getting a lot of clients in a particular with a particular background, or even if it's honestly one client in that particular background, you're educating yourself, right? Outside of just the session, but you're educating yourself on, what is the common experiences of a person from this background, right? From people who are, scholars in this background, right? Or especially people who are scholars that are from this background, you know? Um, that's one piece to it. The other piece is from the client. You could get all the knowledge you can from books and articles, and I'm not saying that that's bad, that's good, but then it's even better if you get this person's experience in that background, right? Because at the end of the day, everyone has their own individual perceptors. We are all perceiving our experience differently, even if two people in the same home perceive things differently. So I'm trying to understand, how did you understand the world that you grew up in, you know? And with that information, it helps inform me in how I approach. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Mhm.
And how is it with clients if we find that they're afraid of losing control if they express anger? And maybe this is shown in the office, or how do we as clinicians see that?
How do we see it in the sense of how do we work with it? How do we see it and how do we explain it?
Yeah, how do we work with the clients in being able to understand it and show it in that positive, healthy way to work through anger?
Yes. First, we given if we are joint in the understanding, okay, here's my anger, is it necessarily something that's problematic? I think that sometimes, sometimes I get clients who come in and they were told that they had to come because of the words of their parent, because of the words of their partner, or some other agency that said that they have to come in, and they don't necessarily think that their anger is bad. And honestly, sometimes it's really not. Given all that they might be experiencing, at the situation that they're in, it might actually be the only reasonable response to that experience. So first we have to be in agreement about what is the experience that's being had, right? So I am big on validating a person's experience. And as clinicians, we have to be better at validating a person's experience and not doing our validation based on what we from some institution has determined is the right way of being when you're angry, right? So when I'm understanding this person's story and I'm able to validate their experience, I'm able to validate their feeling, right, in a particular moment. After that, when they're saying, okay, it's coming from me, it's intrinsic. I would like to change some of these behaviors, right? Now we can work together and we go bring together all the things that we've said so far. One, I need to understand my somatic experience, right? I need to understand my cognitive experience. So what am I feeling, right, on a body level? What am I thinking, right? How does the body connect with the mind, subcortical, cortical? And then we can start developing grounding skills to help me with that experience, right? If I'm ruminating, if I'm overwhelmed, if I've moved into that DPA, so I help the person manage those experiences with grounding skills. And then we develop coping skills. We develop strategies in how to express communication skills on how to express my anger, right? A simple one, starting a situation with I feel, right? Instead of me wielding my anger to criticize, wielding my anger to break a person down, we lead with vulnerability and we assess for safe spaces, right? Communicating with the person that, hey, I really want us to move to a place of agreement and understanding. And so I really want to practice telling you what I feel instead of telling you who you are, right? Or who I interpret you to be, so that might be the solution in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases, that might be the way that I have to operate. In other cases, a coping skill might be, hey, I'm going to need 10 to 20 minutes away from you. You know what I mean? Sometimes you articulate that, sometimes you don't even articulate that, right? You just go and you take that time. Ultimately, what I need is boundaries, right? Because if anger, my guardian, is trying to protect my needs, I help my guardian protect my needs by setting up boundaries. And there's a myriad of boundaries that I can enact in order to protect my needs, right? And I sift through those, whether it's a mind boundary, what I say to someone, what I allow them to say to me, a time boundary, the time that I restrict myself with a person, a space boundary, going to that concept of, hey, I'm going to take some time away from you. I'm going to go to another room. I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to cycle. I'm going to do something for myself. Maybe maybe go play a sport or something, or play basketball, or even playing video games. I take my space boundary, right? Physical boundary. Maybe I'm not going to hug you, right? Something like that. Or please don't touch me in this moment. So I need to enact my boundary. I use my boundary in order to protect my needs, and that's the healthiest way I can go ahead and protect my needs. And then going to the communication skills, maybe I can communicate my frustrations to you afterwards. We can, as the therapist with the client, we can work on building what is it that you want to say and craft that, and then they can articulate that in the real world. Um, maybe grounding was enough. Maybe they just felt overwhelmed. They needed to ground. They ground. It's cool. Everything is fine. So it's every person is going to raise me a different challenge. This is why it's hard for me to just give you a very structured ABC thing. But if the closest approximate that I could give you to an ABC thing would be to ground, um, work with the thoughts, develop coping skills. That would be my closest approximate.
Yeah, thank you. And I love how you shared that space and also of self, right? So what is it that, our clients need, and identifying what would be super helpful for them of that space that they would need, and identifying it, or other tools that would be helpful. So
Mhm.
now, from the clinical aspect, what advice would you give to clinicians who find themselves triggered by a client when they're angry during a session?
We have to do our own self work, right? This job, it doesn't matter what theoretical framework you come from. At the end of the day, we are relational. We are people in relationships with people. And people trigger things in us from our early experiences. If you want to look at that from a neurological perspective, we can say, neural networks, they wire together, neurons that fire together wire together. And so there's that associative network. So we can look at it from, a brain-based place. You can look at it from a philosophical place, right? That, we are just we as human beings are just this large web that are just casted from experience to experience, horizontally and vertically. And so our past selves influence our current selves. And so we have to have this understanding. And if we have this understanding, then as clinicians, we are constantly examining, okay, what is my experience in the room right now? It's very helpful for clients because if I know my experience right now and I have my clinical lens, I can examine the experience I'm having. Maybe I get nervous, maybe I feel like I want to quiet and silence myself. I want to make myself small. Okay, who else in their life might be experiencing this from their anger? You know, maybe I want to get loud. I want to yell at this client. How could you say that? How could you do something like that? Who else in their life might be having this experience with them, right? Which might be causing their anger in response. So I have to do my own self work, not just for me to take care of myself, which is healthy, and it's the only way I can pour into someone else, but also for my client, you know? And it's healing in a bi-directional way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Because we're in this helping profession where we do have to definitely fill our cups first, so that we can show up completely for our clients and show up in, our initial why we're doing our job, and why we love it so much. If from time to time we get burnt out or, have these feelings show up for us, if it be anger or if it be something else. So thank you for sharing.
Mhm.
Um, And so in this, there can definitely be something important for supervisors to help clinicians in this, right? What role would you say supervisors play in helping clinicians navigate these experiences?
Yeah. The, the 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 ideal supervisor is operating the same way that the therapist or the clinician is working with the client, in that, I mean, they're giving them a space to express their anger or their emotion in general. Um, so a good supervisor, a good clinical supervisor, is also building a relationship. They're not just um, you know, telling you definitions and giving you clinical jargon. They are feeling with you. They are examining feeling with you, you know. Um, in that, I think it's profoundly more important and more significant. Again, we are a person-centered field. So you center the person, and then you can bring in all the clinical stuff, right? Okay, let me teach you about, the brain science of anger, right? Learn about the amygdala, learn about the limbic system, learn about how, you have, an intense response that can sometimes quiet the prefrontal cortex, right? You can learn all that stuff, but I think that's not as important as you being able to feel anger, and then the supervisor saying, okay, tell me what's going on with you right now, right? Tell me if you're saying, hey, I'm angry and I need to yell out some of these expletives, right? And so, okay, do that, right? And then afterwards, let's talk about it. How did that feel? What was going on? Why could those words be the only thing to express your experience? Why couldn't you, connect with the years of school that you did to learn all of these other fancy, nomenclatures? Why did you find those words to be the only one that can express your experience? And then we can have that conversation about, okay, that's what happens in the brain, you know? Then we can have a conversation about psychoanalysis. Then we can have a conversation about CBT or IFS or DBT or whatever intervention you want to do. But first, you connect with the person, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
And so of course we have our like technology, things moving so quickly. So looking forward, how do you see the field of anger management evolving in this mental health practice?
Yeah, I think I ideally what I would like to see, you know, even with the only thing I fear, I'll start with my fear before I see what I would like to see. My fear is that as we start becoming more connected to um, technological advancements, right, in the field of psychotherapy, we will neglect this human perspective, right? Like we will outsource a lot of the clinical work to some sort of tool, some sort of whether it's an AI device or something, and then the device might get good at diagnosing the person. Okay, intermittent explosive disorder, done, and then we get that maybe we I don't know wave a wand or we have a Zoom integration where they examine all of the things and say, okay, this person's angry. And then we lose our relationship with the narrative, the story of what is anger for this person, right? And why are they justified in their anger? And we disconnect with our own empathy in our so it's like we stop chasing our connection with people in our connection with robots and devices. So that's my fear is that that happens. Um, but where I would be happy, some of the things I would love to see is, or I think is going to happen in the future, is devices to make something like homework easier, devices that could improve understanding psychology on a on a more scientific base so that we can find some objective findings in whether it's in the brain or um, anywhere else that could give us a more definite definition, better definitions for some of these feelings so that they're not so easily dismissed, right? Um, if we're thinking of just something like, well, we could stick with anger. If we're thinking about anger and we go, oh, there is a brain-based reason for my reactions, you know, um, that can give us a better understanding on it, that can allow us to empathize better with people and going, oh, you're going through something. The way that your brain formed is in such a way that you quote unquote not being upset in this situation is not something that can happen for you easily. And because people's brains are so they're morphed by their personal experiences, that those experiences are all subjective. And so I can't create this 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 um this blanketed way of everybody of operating. So I'm hoping that we can move to, you know, we can develop some tools and technologies that can help us assess that, and so that we don't live in that situation anymore, that we don't live in this current situation anymore. Um, but for the clinician, maybe like a PAL, device where you can even take you can make journal entries, you can, denote, okay, where am I at my anger scale today? You know what I mean? We can capture these readings over time. We can notice trends, things like that. It can give us more of a, it can give us better outlooks on watching what's happening outside of the room, which can help us when we're in the room.
Yeah, that's awesome. Especially again, connecting what's happening outside of the room inside to better help our clients because sometimes there's things that they don't come with or forget to come with. And we always have those, oh, I had a question to ask, but I forgot, right? That
Mhm.
would definitely be super helpful. Thank you for sharing that. Um, as we wrap up here, what is one thing you wish more mental health professionals understood about anger?
There is there is so many things. It's hard to just pinpoint one. In addition to some of my work as an instructor, a clinical trainer, um, a therapist. I also do a lot of writing, so I have a bunch of articles on things like this. on, there's a section on my website, jkcounseling.com, where there's I write blogs on this exact subject because there's so many things I wish people would know about anger. If I were to synthesize it, I think the big thing that I would want people to understand about anger is it's not inherently a bad thing, you know, that you can get angry, recognize that you're angry, identify the need behind that anger, and then you can express that, you know? And that can be transformative in relationships, transformative for yourself. If I feel, for example, if I feel stuck in a position and I'm working in this position for many years and I get upset about it, I can convert that into an action. Maybe I can go to my supervisor and say, listen, I feel that I have given so much of myself to this job. And I think that the next stage is appropriate, right? And maybe the supervisor is dismissive. So I'm angry about that. And I go, okay, you know what? Let me find a new place, right? Or a new career, or maybe I go back to school and get a degree, in whatever, or maybe I'm tired of how a government operating or how my elected official is performing, and I want to tell them that, and I get angry, and so that can move me to action. I could do marches. I can write. I can call up congressmen. So anger is not inherently a bad thing, but when it is seen as bad, when we only look at it as it leads to me breaking my phone by throwing it at the wall, or punching a hole in the said wall, then it gets all of this negative criticism. And then when it has this negative criticism, nobody wants to you know have a relationship with anger anymore. And so but there's so many things I'd have to say. There's more stories that I could share, but we don't have the time. Oh,
Well, thank you so much for sharing the
yeah.
your website. Do you mind repeating it again in case anyone wants to go read the blogs on the extra information?
Yes, there's it's jkcounseling.com. There's a blog section, there's a newsletter section where I talk about social issues and from a clinical lens. And in that, I talk about some of the angers that people have had, in masses, you know. So it just gives you an idea of anger in its different forms so that you can empathize, right? We can all empathize with anger in a better way.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you for sharing that. I was thinking of like Inside Out all over
Yes, I
again.
love that movie.
Um,
Yeah.
and how Joy, like in the first one, like tends to be the main character and it leans more towards sadness, but knowing how each emotion is so important.
Hmm.
So thank you so much for teaching us about anger because
Yeah.
it's so important for us to be aware of and how to help our clients, how to help ourselves, or having those important conversations to really show up for our clients and for ourselves.
Thank you for giving this platform so we can have this discussion.
Yeah, of course. So just sharing some key resources here from our presentation today that you can pause. And again, just want to thank Joel for all of the really, really great insights that he had to share with us today over anger management. We really hope that you can take this information into your practice to better serve your clients, to better serve the community, because we see this day to day with our clients, and maybe even with families that we're serving. So thank you so much, Joel, for our mental health professionals who are listening in, getting able to put this into the practice.
Yes, thank you for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this continuing education course from Agents of Change. Want to earn your CE credits for this course? Visit agentsofchangetraining.com or the link in the description to purchase the course and take the post test. If you're looking for more CEs, check out our unlimited plan. You will get unlimited access to 150 plus ASWB and NBCC approved continuing education courses for one low annual fee. We're always adding new courses. Did I mention we also have 5 free CE credits available too? Check it out at agentsofchangetraining.com.